On the 2.3 liter, we can get you right up to about 350 wheel horsepower. On the 2.7s, we're talking 400 to 425 wheel horsepower. And on the 3.0s, well over 500 wheel horsepower. Hey guys, Jake from 8020 Media here. Today we're talking about performance modifications and upgrades for the newest generation of the Ford Bronco. There are a number of great modifications that you could do to the suspension, to the handling, for off-roading and all of that. But today we're going to be talking specifically about engine modifications and things that you can do to add horsepower and torque to the Ford Bronco. Now, of course, the Bronco comes with 3 different engines. You have the base model 2.3 liter EcoBoost, then you have the 2.7 liter EcoBoost upgrade, and then the Ford Bronco Raptor uses the 3.0 EcoBoost. All of these engines are part of the EcoBoost family, so they use very similar architecture. However, the primary difference is that the 2.3 liter EcoBoost is an inline 4, so it's a 4-cylinder engine that uses a turbocharger, and then the 2.7 and 3.0 are both V6s. The caveat with the 3.0 is that the 3.0 is actually twin turbocharged instead of just a single turbocharger that's used on both the 2.3 and the 2.7. Now, because all of these engines are turbocharged and generally use the same architecture, the performance modifications for all of them is the same. We're going to want to do the same basic bolt-on modifications to all of these to unleash power. The only difference is going to be how much horsepower you start with and how much horsepower you end with based on these modifications. Of course, because the 2.3 liter is a 4-cylinder turbocharged and the 3.0 is a V6 twin turbocharged, the 2.3 is going to have the least power potential, the 3.0 is going to have the most, and the 2.7 is going to fall right in the middle. So before we go ahead and start talking about the best modifications for these Ford Broncos, let's just talk a little bit about the power limitations of each of these different engines. The 2.3 EcoBoost can get to around 350 wheel horsepower before the turbocharger becomes the primary limitation, and the torque is limited to about 425 to 450 before you start running into the risk of damaging the internals of this engine. And so when it comes to the 2.3 liter, proper tuning is extremely important because 350 wheel horsepower is about the limit that you can get to from a horsepower standpoint, but these engines are predominantly limited by their torque. And so you want to work with someone who understands the torque limitations of these engines to make sure that at 350 wheel horsepower, you're not blasting way past 425 to 450 wheel torque. The 2.7 EcoBoost can get to about 400 to 425 wheel horsepower with the modifications on this list. To get to 450 or past 450 wheel horsepower, you're going to start needing to look into turbocharger upgrades and a number of other additional supporting modifications. 400 to 425 is what these basic bolt-ons will get you, and you're going to be looking at a quite expensive build if you want to start pushing past that, since turbocharger upgrades are expensive. And then the 3.0 EcoBoost is immensely capable because it is a twin turbocharged setup. Just tuning alone can take these engines easily over 500 wheel horsepower. So the most important thing here is going to be supporting modifications, but the one caveat is that the Ford Bronco Raptor has a lot more limited aftermarket support currently, and so you don't have quite as many options for upgrades like downpipes and intercoolers, which are already readily and widely available for the 2.3 and 2.7 liter. It'll likely take another year or two before enough options really start popping up for these 3.0s. So now that we've talked about the power limits of these engines, let's go ahead and talk about the modifications that will go ahead and get you up to those power levels that I just discussed. The first best modification for any Ford Bronco is going to be tuning. Tuning is where the big power gains are going to come from because these engines are turbocharged. It's going to offer your best bang for the buck from a price per horsepower standpoint. It's very easy to unlock significant amounts of power just with tuning alone, simply by turning up the boost that the turbocharger is producing. Tuning can take you to some pretty serious power levels, and so all of the modifications that come after this are really to help optimize your tuning and to help maximize the efficiency and reliability of your engine when it's tuned. Our second modification on the list, and that's going to be a cold air intake. A cold air intake is just going to help supply the turbocharger or turbochargers with more air. So by supplying the turbocharger with more air, we can help it spool more freely, more quickly. We'll see improved throttle response. You'll actually notice some small fuel economy benefits with it as well. But ultimately what we're doing here is bringing more air to the turbocharger to allow the turbocharger to operate more efficiently, which allows it to spool faster, which allows it to make more horsepower, and all in all will help reduce the amount of heat that the turbocharger is producing, which is good from a reliability standpoint. After tuning in an intake, the third modification is going to be a downpipe or exhaust upgrades. Now that we're bringing more air into the engine, the turbocharger is spooling at a faster rate and producing higher boost levels, it's important to get that air out of the engine more quickly. And the downpipe is where the most restriction is within the exhaust system. The downpipe causes a lot of back pressure buildup, and that back pressure acts as a force against the turbocharger. And so it slows down the turbocharger spool, puts more stress on the turbocharger, ultimately leading to higher exhaust gas temps, higher engine temps, and a slower turbo spool, which is bad for engine reliability and turbocharger reliability. So we want to upgrade the downpipe to reduce back pressure within the exhaust system, which is going to allow the turbocharger to operate more efficiently and produce less heat. Now, of course, there are other exhaust modifications that we can do, like a catback or downpipe back exhaust system. The rest of the exhaust, there is a benefit to upgrading it. It will help reduce the back pressure a little bit further. But I want to say that the downpipe is going to be the most important thing because that's where the majority of the back pressure buildup occurs. And on these engines, the catalytic converter is housed within the downpipe, and so you have options of either going catless or sticking with a high flow catted option, which is probably a lot more available on the market just from an emission standpoint. So after tuning an intake and a downpipe, the fourth modification on our list is going to be an upgraded intercooler. The factory intercooler, especially on something like the 2.3 liter, is very small, and it's just not quite efficient or good enough once we start talking about adding boost, increasing the amount of power that these engines are making, and flowing a lot more air in and out of the engine. And so upgrading the intercooler will provide some performance benefits, but the biggest thing that it does is add a huge reliability benefit, and it prevents you from experiencing something called heat soak, which can actually rob you of 10, 20, or 30 wheel horsepower in hot conditions when you're doing very aggressive driving. An intercooler is going to help us consistently send colder air into the engine, which is one of the best things you can do from a reliability standpoint, but it's also going to give us more consistent performance and prevent us from experiencing heat soak, which causes a loss of performance. So overall, definitely don't overlook an intercooler. I know they are a little bit more expensive of a modification, and you're probably only talking about getting 5 or maybe 10 wheel horsepower out of them, and so it might not sound as appealing from a power standpoint or performance gain standpoint, but it's crucial for reliability. So guys, those are the 4 basic bolt-on modifications here. All of these modifications should be able to take you right up to the power limits of the stock turbo on all of these engines. However, there is a 5th bonus modification that I want to talk about if you really want to get everything you can out of these engines in stock form, and that's ethanol fueling. Ethanol, or E85 gas, burns at a significantly higher octane, and so you produce a lot more power running ethanol fuel than you do on your standard 91 or 93 octane. These EcoBoost engines can't handle 100% E85, but they can handle about E30 blends. So that's 30% ethanol and the rest gasoline. And so you can do a mix at a gas station to get an E30 blend. And just by running an E30 blend, you'd be able to add an extra 15, 20, 30 wheel horsepower onto any one of these engines. The only caveat here is that you need to be properly tuned for it. So you'll need to work with a custom tuner to get a custom ethanol map produced for it. So ethanol fueling is a good thing to look into if you really want to maximize these engines in completely stock form. And once you start talking about doing turbocharger upgrades and getting into those more advanced modifications, ethanol fueling is definitely something that you're going to need. So anyways, guys, that covers it here. We're talking about 4 modifications that are ultimately going to run you somewhere between $2,000 to $2,500. And on the 2.3 liter, we can get you right up to about 350 wheel horsepower. On the 2.7s, we're talking 400 to 425 wheel horsepower. And on the 3.0s, well over 500 wheel horsepower. Just keep in mind that things like downpipes and intercoolers are going to be a little bit more limited for the 3.0s right now until companies have enough time to develop all these modifications for them. So guys, that wraps up our video here. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please click that like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for all the future content we have coming on the EcoBoost engine family and the Ford Broncos.